Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shepherd's Corner. Here we have conversations with our Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon. Today and this week, we are celebrating Emancipation. And in his article in the Catholic News, and I'm sure that everybody got their copy, I want to quote him where he says, "Emancipation is a watershed moment in our nation that must never be forgotten. It has shaped us for better or for worse and has laid the foundations for modern Trinidad and Tobago. Our emancipation journey continues." Hello, Archbishop Charles Jason Gordon. How are you, sir?
Doing really good. Happy Emancipation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking on this subject and challenging all of us to look at emancipation as a journey that continues. Our emancipation journey continues. So what?
Absolutely.
So what do we celebrate on Emancipation Day then?
Well, I would argue that there's no event that has shaped our national identity more than the day that slavery ended. Emancipation Day has defined us for so many reasons. The fact that human beings were enslaved by others and subject to heinous crimes that were common at that time is a stain on humanity in general and on the British and on Europe in particular. I don't think that people understand both the nature of the crime, or do they understand the depth to which it has marked our civilization and has ingrained itself in our civilization in so many different ways that we're even now beginning to see and beginning to understand. And that's why I'm arguing that there's no event that has shaped our national identity more than the day that slavery ended, more than Emancipation.
You know,
and that I believe has been the watershed event that has created the modern Trinidad and Tobago.
You say it has created the modern Trinidad and Tobago, but you know, Trinidad and Tobago is made up of so many races, and you know, we have the indigenous people, we have the descendants of the African slaves, we have the descendants of the indigenous races that came, the Portuguese, the Chinese, the East Indians, and so on. So when you see that our emancipation journey continues, do you see that coming out of emancipation, that it continues to affect all the nations in Trinidad and Tobago, or only the African nation?
No, I would say that that emancipation as an event is what brought all these other nations into Trinidad and Tobago. And without that event of emancipation, we wouldn't have had all the others coming. But before I get to the nations, I just want to make another point that I think very important, that the vast wealth of Europe was acquired by the labor of slaves on plantations in the West Indies. Okay? And that is something that people don't often reckon with. Britain and France were vying for who had superiority to dominate the world economic stage. Britain and France went to war. And part of that war was Britain annexing Martinique and Guadeloupe. And once that happened, the revenues of Britain shot straight up because those were two sugar-producing plantations. And France ended up losing out, although it came into the war the economic dominant one. It came out of the war the one who lost. Britain became the world superpower by 15, 20 years later because it had annexed major sugar plantation holdings from the Caribbean. And so we have to understand the wealth of modern Europe, of Britain and modern Europe, also being fueled by the plantation system in the West Indies, the enforced slavement, the rape and the murder, from the very dark and the history of this archipelago that we call Caribbean. We have to understand that too, that there's this symbiotic relationship between what we experience in the region in terms of slavery and all that it brought, and the wealth that Britain emerged with because of its holdings of West Indian sugar plantations. And that has to be understood before we get now to the emancipation. And just want to add in here that Dr. Eric Williams, one of his central thesis on capitalism and slavery was that it was the slave was an active participant in bringing the end of slavery, as much as Wilberforce and company were active in Europe in lobbying against slavery. The slave made the plantation system a system that was not sustainable. It became more and more costly, and more difficult to sustain, and therefore it as an economic model became outmoded. And so you can't see the slave just as a passive participant in the process of emancipation. And that for our ancestors in the region, they participated in this emancipation movement, and by making the plantation a very difficult economic model to sustain. And that was the rioting, the burning, all the different ways in which they made the thing unsustainable. But that dynamic between Europe and the Caribbean, and the declaration then in 1807 that British slavery came to an end, that declaration of the end of the slave trade, not slavery yet, but of the slave trade in 1807, that set in motion immigration into Trinidad. So the Chinese arrived. They arrived in 1806. Once they understood that the slave trade was ending, they sent now for other peoples whom Britain had annexed their territory. So the first group coming was a group of Chinese in 1806. And they came in preparation for the scarcity of labor. You have to remember that Trinidad is the most southern of all the islands, and it was underpopulated, grossly underpopulated. The cellular population in the 1770s really brought large amounts of slaves and masters into Trinidad and Tobago. But still it was very underpopulated at the end of the slave trade. And so they were looking for more labor. Enter the Chinese. Emancipation from slavery happened in 1834. And then the first group of Portuguese arrived from Madeira in 1834. The slaves were still forced to work until 1838. And then the Fatal Rosac arrived with 225 East Indians in 1845, 7 years later. So my argument is that the end of the slave trade, the end of slavery, and thus emancipation, is what brought all of these other peoples that we now have in Trinidad, the Portuguese, the Chinese, the East Indian. They all came for the need, because of the need of labor with the end of the slave trade.
All right, so therefore you're saying that because of the rioting, because of the pushback, it became ungovernable. So you're saying that the African slaves also precipitated the end of slavery as we know it, because there was some pushback by them, the rioting and so on.
So, and then you had beet sugar from the East that was being processed by labor, not by slaves, that was far more economical, cheaper, an easier commodity to manufacture. And so the rise of the beet sugar market with free labor and the cost of the riots and the mayhem of the plantation with forced slave labor created the situation where the economic model of the plantation was unsustainable. Now, this is straight Eric Williams' thesis. And it was a revolutionary thesis when he did it in his day in Oxford. But in other words, we have to see emancipation not simply as a fiat from the master out of goodwill of the master, but bringing of the plantation system to its knees by the slaves and by the rebellions, by the riots, by the fires. We still celebrate Cambole. The most terrifying thing for the slave owners, the fires that would be set just at that dry season time, just before harvest, where they could lose a whole crop easily. So this dynamism in our early history is something that we have to understand, that we weren't, spectators in this event, this epic event. We were participators. And so we have to also understand that the events from 1834 to today also leaves us as participators in the history that has unfolded.
You mentioned in your article that a lot of the wealth of Britain and Europe came out of slavery. Now, you've had many arguments saying that there should be reparation for that. I know, and what's your thinking? I know that we are saying that our emancipation journey continues, but do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, something is odd, eh? Something is really, really odd. You pick up people against their will, and you bring them from one part of the world to another part of the world. You sell them and you make money off of it. Your nation makes money off of the sale of these people. Okay? Then you have a form of conscience or economic model that has failed. Take whichever logic you want to go with. And you then set these people free. And the best moral logic of the day was if people still had to work for 4 years to pay back the landowner of the costs that the landowner expended in buying them. And nobody asked, what about compensation for the person who was either born in slavery and lived like a slave, or brought from Africa and treated like a commodity and sold on a block like a slave? Nobody asked about the reparation or the compensation to the person who was enslaved. All compensation and huge amounts were paid to the landowners. That's why Haiti is still poor today. The compensation that Haiti was forced to pay to France for the slaves who were freed is what bankrupted Haiti and put Haiti on the underdevelopment path that Haiti is still on today, why David Rudder has to sing, Haiti are crying.
I see that you're well read, sir, because I was hoping that you would not forget that part about Haiti and Mother France,
Yes.
and Toussaint Louverture and his whole, his whole fighting against the great Napoleon, and winning. And still Haiti is paying for that.
Because, and again, it is the underdevelopment of the slave that paid for the economic advancement of Europe. It's a simple economic equation. And people say, yes, this was 170 how much years ago? And I would say, yes, it was. But I would say the effects of emancipation have not yet been undone in our region. And that's a single point I am making. Is there a cause for reparation? I think that's a topic that is well open and could and maybe should even be explored because of the lack of compensation for the slave at the time. Georgetown University, for instance, has a whole movement right now in reparation for those of African descent, because in the archives of Georgetown, they realized that one stage the university owned slaves and profited from slaves. And that contributed to build the university. And so there's a fund that has been put aside now for the education of African Americans as a compensation for what took part in the history. But let's not go to the reparation piece. The point I'm trying to make is that so many things that we take for granted in the demography of Trinidad and Tobago, both our racial admixture and our economic disparity, are the result of emancipation and the result of the slavery that existed before emancipation. And the fact of our freedom, our ethnic and religious composition, flows as a direct result from emancipation. That emancipation was that watershed in our nation's history, in our Caribbean history, that set in motion so much of what happened since then. And until we are willing to face it honestly, we're not going to bring healing, and we're not going to do justice to the nation that we're trying to build and the peoples who live in it.
I see you said for better or for worse. It sounds like a marriage. For better or for worse. You quoted Caribbean theologian, Cartwright Davis, when you said emancipation still coming.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book that Davis wrote, Emancipation Still Coming, where he argues that, the emancipation is the key to understand and reflect upon the Caribbean experience. He says the key in Caribbean society, with its experience of slavery, colonization, neocolonization, and structural dependence, is emancipation, the pursuit, proclamation, and practice of human freedom. That he says that's the key to understand the whole of our history. Now Davis comes from Jamaica, where the population is the vast majority of African origin. And so the logic is different in Jamaica and in most of the rest of the Caribbean than it would be in Trinidad and Guyana, which is so south. But the logic continues when you understand that who has come here has come because of the end of the slave trade, the end of slavery, and the need for new labor on a plantation system. That's why we have the demography we have. One writer calls it demography by fiat. That you just wrote a note, yes. and that's the demography that we end up with. So this understanding of emancipation is not just emancipation as an event. I'm also proposing that emancipation is a lens through which we must look to interpret the whole of our society. And I'm also saying that emancipation is a process that we must understand in terms of the modern Trinidad and Tobago that we are becoming.
You said beginning in the 1700s with many false starts, the movement got its first event with the legislation passed in both the Houses of Commons and the Lords, and finally being signed by King George. And
that would have been in 1806, sorry, right. 1807.
And you said the act of the abolition of the slave trade banned Britain and its dependents from trading in slavery, right? But emancipation in 1834 still forced ex-slaves to work on the plantations for 40 hours per week. That's amazing.
But that's back to what I'm saying when you ask about reparation. You know, it's groupthink is a funny thing. It's a really funny thing when you have groupthink. They ask a single question: who is compensating the plantation owner for their loss of property? You have to understand, from an accounting perspective, you had your ledger of assets, and in 1833 you had so many cows, so many sheep, so many this, so many that, so many men slaves, so many women slaves, so many children slaves. 1834, now a whole set of your property is not on your ledger anymore. Who is compensating the plantation owner for the loss of property that he has experienced because you've signed this Declaration of Emancipation? And that was the only question. That was the question. So the answer was, well, the ex-slave has to work out the cost by giving free labor back to the plantation for 4 years. And that's how the plantation owner recovers the loss on the ledger. This is the logic. Eh? Now somebody could have had a different logic. Eh? A different logic could have been, well, these people were forced in the most horrendous ways to live and to work for the last how many ever years, how many hundreds of years, in conditions that were intolerable, inhumane, and immoral. And in fact, the plantations which earn such great profits have to now compensate these people by giving them land, by giving them a house, and enough land for them to support themselves and their family. That could have been a different logic. It was a logic that was used when the East Indian came as indentured labor, that once they worked for X number of years, they were given a parcel of land and what it was required to build a little house and to start their family. I'm trying to show you how groupthink sorted only from a accounting perspective on the ledger of the plantation system, and not from a human perspective on the ledger of the soul of the millions of Africans who were brought into the region and who were robbed of their life, completely robbed of a life. And at the same time, when slavery ended, they now had to pay back the person who exploited them by giving them 4 years of labor. Now, you know, groupthink is a wonderful thing, you know.
I was
it's a wonderful thing.
I was about to sing a David Rudder song. I was singing a David Rudder song. This is not a fetid here. This is madness, because that is madness in terms of, if you think, looking through the lens of the man who was forced and uprooted from his home with wife and children, or sometimes without his wife and children, and forced to come here and to be slaves.
But why I'm raising that is because the groupthink puts the ledger of the businessman who is making profit as more important than the ledger of the human life that has been robbed. And I'm saying that a similar logic is at work in our societies today.
But I totally agree with you, because one could look and we see sometimes kind of shift in the conversation, but we see sometimes why trade unions are so much up in arms when they look at colonial, what do you say, as these big economic companies or again coming into our lands to exploit the wealth of the land and taking the majority of the wealth out of it. Right? And I mean, we see it with the oil and gas, you know, and so many of the other things that you would see all over the world. You know, here isn't this another form of something that we need to be emancipated?
Well, they have all of these relationships, and they could be very healthy and just, but they could be very unhealthy and very unjust. But from the perspective of the compensation of the laborer, of the slave, or the lack thereof, and the compensation of the plantation owner, from all of this perspective, Courtright Davis's claim is correct, I think. In our societies, we need to see emancipation as a key to interpret all social reality.
Right.
So if you start with the Cambole riots of 1881, or the Jose massacre of 1884, and the water riots of 1903, which destroyed the Red House, these are all part of the process of emancipation that is still coming. Each one of these uprisings came because of a collision between a people who felt disenfranchised and a state that was set up for the protection of the business owner. And the collision happened whenever there was a lack of compensation or insufficient compensation for the person to have a decent livelihood. It erupted in these riots. And I think that that's part and parcel of Trinidad and Tobago. And it's part of our national cycle that we do this collision every so often. And if we look at that, the biggest one, the Butler riots in 1937, that was another significant moment in this process. Better wages were now being demanded, and the ex-slave was now turned into a worker. And notice this 100 years later. This is 100 years later.
Yes.
The ex-slave now turned to worker was beginning to demand a fair share of the economic pie. And if you don't understand Butler riot from the perspective of 100 years later, the laborer is now saying, folks, I can't live on the wage that you're being paid, that I'm being paid. We have to do something better than that. If you can't understand that, then you're not understanding the social history. And then the Black Power movement in the 1960s and 70s, which culminated in a significant milestone, the 1970 protests. Here, I would say the essence of emancipation, the raw nerve of emancipation was touched nationally. In 1937, the economic relationships were touched, but in the 1970s, the raw nerve was touched, because it was really about, will you dare to understand that Black people are human beings, equal in dignity, with equal rights to everyone else who lives in this country? Because that was not self-evident in the 1960s. It was not self-evident. It wasn't self-evident in the banks. It wasn't self-evident in business. It wasn't self-evident in so many places. In the church, it was not self-evident. I mean, the struggles when the first priest brought a steel band into the sanctuary to play, that was not self-evident at all. So the whole society had this ingrained plantation prejudice of the inferiority of the African, because the African was a slave, and therefore created this whole superstructure on top of it that both kept the African underdeveloped, under-resourced, underwaged, and therefore with prejudice in not being equal as a human being. And all of this is a lot of stuff that we're dealing with. But all of this is playing out, and I mean, Butler was just 100 years after. By the 1970s, we've gone on another couple of years. Well, but all of this is just so much part of the national psyche that we call Trinidad and Tobago.
My challenge is that for many people, they don't know the history. And it's sad to say that, you know, I remember in college, you know, and this is a process that just, you know, something that just came to my mind, that they taught European history.
Yeah.
Caribbean history was only taught for the boys in the lower stream. That was amazing, you know.
Yeah.
But
when you got into Form 4 and 5.
Correct. But this is not taught, and I believe that this should be taught all the way through from primary school. Little bits of it to shape, you know, based on the minds of the students. But
in fact, it is one of the things that I have always mused at. The great historian and educator that Dr. Eric Williams was, that he didn't have his book, Columbus to Castro, as a text in Forms 1 to 3.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, as Prime Minister, he could have just wrote the edict. That's your text for Form 1 to 3. I want everybody to learn it. And at least start a national understanding of who we are. And you're right. The absence of a Caribbean history curriculum for Forms 1 to 3 meant that only those who chose history in the upper levels ever got exposed to Caribbean history and to our understanding of life. And that's a tremendous challenge. But it's part of what I'm touching on. You see, when you understand that up until the 1960s, the African was still seen as lesser human being than the white, and that there was no sense of equality or respect, that there was a differential in humanity. If you understand that as the genesis of the 1970s protests, then you understand that that set of protests was a direct line to Emancipation Day in 1834. Because now, whereas freedom, economic protests, now we're protesting about the very nature of the human being and the very nature of the African human being. And I think that has to be understood for what it is. And that, I think, is vital to understand the thesis I am promoting, that emancipation is both an event and it is a process. And that's why I'm talking about our emancipation journey continues.
I'm going back to your you know, where you talked about what was at stake was the dignity and status of the ex-slave and the ex-indentured laborer. Were they lesser humans than the white population, or were they equal in every respect to others? Again, only through protests, and we see that over throughout the world. Only through protests was the point made and new ground gained. And I mean, that is so critical for us as a people to understand that.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, Uncle Ken Gordon tells the story. He has it in his book, Getting It Right, where when he landed a job in radiodiffusion in the 40s, a friend of the family who worked in radiodiffusion came to the family home and brought an ad from 10 years earlier for the job he just landed. And the bottom small print on that ad was, "Blacks need not apply."
My God.
Okay?
Yeah, yeah.
So this is living history, okay? The people who are alive who would remember reading about jobs for which they were qualified, which would have said Blacks need not apply. So this is still in our living psyche. And that's why I'm talking about emancipation both as an event, 1834, 1838, emancipation as a process, 1937, 1960, plus all the water riots and Woolsey riots and all of those other things. And yes, the indentured laborer was treated like the slave for the most part, except they were given a leg up that the slave never had. Because when they finished their term of indenture, they were either given passage back home or they were given a piece of land to start. And therefore, if you have land, you could do so much more.
Yeah.
Nobody gave the African slave a piece of land to start. If that had been given back in the 1834, that was part of the Emancipation Treaty, that every slave was given 10,000 square foot of land, that from the state or from the plantation, either one. I think you would have had a different social history than the social history we have.
So our emancipation journey continues, and Archbishop Jason Gordon is having a conversation with us so that we understand that emancipation wasn't just an event, but it continues even now. And going back to the 1970s and the protests, you say businesses began to hire Black workers and put them in the front to face customers.
For the first time.
For the first time.
For the first time.
And
those that resisted were highlighted, like the famous case in the country club. There was a Black doctor staying in Hilton Hotel. And Hilton Hotel and the country club had an agreement that any patron of Hilton Hotel had automatic access to the country club. This was an agreement. And a Black doctor turns up at the country club. So he has the money, eh? He has the money. He's a Black American doctor. So he has the money. He's paying for the Hilton Hotel. Nobody have him there. He's paying for it. But when he turns up at the country club, they refuse to give him entry because of his race. Then this would have been in 1967. And that became a campaign, a media campaign by the Daily Express that highlighted the inequality and got the whole ire of the white business community against the Express. They boycott the Express because they kept this thing on pushing for an apology from the country club, which was not forthcoming. But this is all the boil up to 1970. And that's why I'm saying that the 1970 was really about the equality of the human being. And I think it is part of the emancipation journey that starts in the 1830s. And that's why I'm saying it's a process, one that is not yet completed. We have so much more that we still have to do, but we're heading down the road.
I remember last year your article on emancipation, and I'll bring forward some of the thoughts. People need to know a little bit about our history on Trinidad and Tobago and Emancipation Day. That we were the first country in the world to celebrate Emancipation Day with a public holiday, to recognize it as such.
Trinidad and Tobago, sweet TNT. And other countries have followed suit.
Yes.
And it was because of the recognition of how significant this day is for the whole of Trinidad and Tobago. But if we're going to continue the emancipation journey, I have to go to the little black boy. In 1997, when the Calypsonian Winston Gypsy Peters sang Little Black Boy, I think it touched a nerve right through our society. He named something that was so alarming that the Calypso was both filled with horror and awe at the same time. Why are our little black boys not going to school to learn? Why do they have little ambition? Why are there so many dependent on drugs and becoming prisoners and vagrants? And Gypsy ends his calypso by saying, when you're black, you're just black. You can't help but be black, but be conscious. But because you're black, you don't stay in the back. be black, but be conscious. And Gypsy was saying to the little black boy that you might be black, but it doesn't mean that you have to stay in the back. Be black, but be conscious. What Gypsy was naming here in the 1990s was the unfinished project of emancipation, as it was starting to affect the nation in a way that was alarming, as we saw the rise of the dropout of the little black boy, and the rise of the gangs and the drugs, the rise of a really difficult proposition in our society, that as the underdevelopment of the little black boy started to take root in various communities in Trinidad and Tobago, the national security became a bigger and bigger problem throughout our nation. And I cite this calypso because it names it before it explodes. In the early 2000s, when the murder rate, so all here in the 90s, the murder rate was still in the 100 and something range, or less than 100 range. But in the 2000s, when the murder rate hits the 400 and 500, it was because of what Gypsy was naming here. And I would say it is the unfinished project of emancipation. That yes, be black, but be conscious, could be translated into, yes, you had a bad start. Yes, your family had a bad start. Yes, your whole community had a bad start. But you know something? We could do better than this. And the question that had to be asked at that stage, and if we had asked it then, it would have saved us billions of dollars, billions. The question to have been asked then was, why was the little black boy disconnecting from the education system? Remember that Dr. Williams said, the future of the nation, look in the school bag.
Correct.
Look in the school bag. And David Rudder added, yes, future knife, future gun, future jail yard. Because like Gypsy, Rudder saw, again in the 90s, Rudder saw that the ambition that drove the generation before to advancement through education had somehow got derailed, and now there was a disconnect from education, and it was creating new future knife, future gun, future jail yard, was creating a gang mentality that was creating havoc within our nation.
Yeah, but I have a big challenge here. I mean, you know, since 1962 and onwards, we've had our own government. We have had our own black government. And therefore, why couldn't our politicians, I mean, listen, you spoke about Dr. Eric Williams saying that our future is in our school bag. You have our Calypsonians who've been speaking about this and singing about this so long. Wasn't it important that the government, which was mainly a black government, could read into the pain, read into that, like you said, the emancipation journey continues, and therefore put things in place to ensure that healing could take place with regards to the little black man, and education is a key.
So Dr. Williams saw that, but you have to understand that this is not about a stroke of a pen. That this is really about the change of a mentality. So there was a generation before that understood that the future of the nation was in the school bag. There were families that didn't have 2 cents to rub together, but their children was going to school, and they were making every sacrifice for the children to go to school. My father told me, some friends when he was in school in Tobago, the boy stumped his toe, and the first thing he says, thank God I didn't have on my mother's shoe. Because they had one pair of shoes. You could stomp your toe, but don't mash up the shoe because another one ain't coming.
Right.
They didn't, but every sacrifice was made for the education of the children. Then we had a generation that disconnected from that. And we have to ask why. So part of that is a large immigration from the rest of the Caribbean that was not assimilated well into Trinidad and Tobago. Part of it was that. And part of it was the modern complexity of education, where we brought all of our children now into the education system, but the education system was not ready for all of the children. And I think that that's a big part of it. Universal education was not only a mandate, it was a necessity, but we weren't ready for it. And so a lot of the children were just slipping through the cracks and were unready for education for a whole range of reasons that we could go into. But it is the continuation of the Emancipation Project is what I am arguing. So the greatest challenge to the stability and development of our beautiful nation is the lack of development of our little black boys, African and Indian, in central Trinidad, in coastal Trinidad, in Laventille, Beetham, Sealots, and environs. We need to begin reading. We need to begin reading our current challenges of these little black boys from the perspective of the unfinished emancipation project of the 1830s. And we have to start understanding that the challenge that we're facing with guns, with gangs, with these pockets of deep underdevelopment is precisely a challenge that comes from emancipation, that is crying out for us to continue our process of emancipation that is required if our nation is going to find its feet as an independent and free nation among the nations of the world.
But we've had many successful, if you want to call them Afro-Trinidadian, East Indian Trinidadian
absolutely
people, you know,
absolutely
who've done so well, and they are heroes. But where do we see that being translated back into the communities?
Yes. But you have to understand that many times those, and I mean, we could just keep calling it from music, there are sports. You could start with Hazley and Atto and Brian Lara and continue all along the road. Arts, you know, there's so many, and I'm in full agreement. But I'm saying that the pockets of underdevelopment are the residue of the plantation system that we have not yet tackled consciously. And until we tackle it consciously, that we're not going to move it forward. So the systemic problem where the community, the school, the leaders, the institutions have failed to address a real challenge that is facing us. And I'm seeing a real challenge is systemic underdevelopment of our poor Black communities. And when I say Black, I'm talking both of Afro and East Indian Trinidad and Tobago. Because those communities, whether you think of those in Central or those in Southeast Port of Spain, they are there. And we know the communities, and those communities bring a higher rate of crime than other communities in our country. And is not, I mean, that is not magical thinking. And therefore, the solution is not a difficult solution. It means that we have to embrace these communities and bring development, emancipation to its next stage of development, where these communities that have not surfaced out of the plantation mentality, we have to bring these communities to the levels of education to integrate into and contribute towards modern Trinidad and Tobago. And that's the rural coastal areas, that's central, and it's 60-something thousand indigent poor Trinidad and Tobago has right now. Well, the last number we knew that number would have grown because of COVID.
Yeah, but you would have some people arguing and say, well, we've put so much money into this and we put so much money into that community. Are you saying those have merely been handouts and not proper formation, not proper plans for development, and not looking at the long term and just saying a quick fix is to say, all right, we give them a $5 million pool, we give them a $1 million basketball court. But
all of these are elements, okay? These are elements in identity and development. And I would say, yeah, a lot of money has been wasted, okay, fine. But let's get past that. But Gypsy's point of consciousness is the most important point, because if you understand that you are in a community where the economy is really highly challenged, the schools are failing, the institutions are failing, and there's no one to speak within the community for what you really need, then now we're moving from the wage in the 1930s to the identity and equality in the 1960s. We're now moving to the equipping for modern Trinidad and Tobago in the 2000s, in the 21st century. I'm saying these people, these communities have to be equipped for modern, to participate and contribute to modern Trinidad and Tobago. And it's not going to come just by throwing money at it. It has to come by shifting consciousness. There's a value system that has to change. There's a way of seeing that has to change. Poverty is really not about money, you know. I could take 4 people, reduce them to poverty, put them in the same community to live, give them the same $500 a month to start up with. And those who were rich before will be rich again within 6 months to a year. Poverty is not about money. Money is only one dimension of poverty. It's also about the social connections. It's also about the political connections, the intellectual grasp. It's also about the consciousness required. Poverty is a very complex thing, and I'm saying that what we're dealing with is the next stage of the emancipation process that this nation has to put its head, heart, and life around.
Where do we go from here? How do we celebrate? How do we move our people from this level of, I would say, enslavement to be truly emancipated?
You know, if I had my way, and I know a lot of people now will be happy to hear what I say, and that's okay with me, because it's not about popularity. Emancipation Day should be the day when we put before the nation all the heroes who, despite the odds, excelled and proved that little black boys can achieve excellence nationally, regionally, and globally. And you know, the list of excellence of Trinidadians and Tobagonians who have achieved on the national, on the regional, and on the global stage is amazing. We should understand, you know, there are 2 competing agendas. One agenda is looking at everything from the ancestral past as the interpretive key to understanding what we're dealing with today. And I think that that's what we do a lot with emancipation. So we look back to Africa and back to the Sphinx, back to the pharaohs, to the high civilization that Africa was at one stage, but enslaved people too. But Africa was enslaving people too. So we look back at that. I would like us to focus emancipation more as a looking at ourselves. First, the incredible achievements we have made from 1834 to today. Nobody would have predicted that we could have reached to where we reached to with as little challenge as we have had. with all the incredible tensions of our society. Nobody would have predicted the kind of people we have produced. Out of ghettoed communities, we have brought incredible shining lights to the world stage. That's what we should look at in Emancipation Day. And the other thing we need to look at from my perspective is the emancipation that is still coming. And every Emancipation Day, we should ask ourselves, what's the next most important thing that we need to do as a nation to move the process and journey of emancipation along to its next stage? And find the commitment on this Emancipation Day to focus that energy, that resource, that development to wherever that is most needed to take us to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage of our development as a young country. That's how I would see us celebrating Emancipation Day. I think we need to put before the eyes of our young people all of the models. Because what is freedom? What is freedom? Freedom to have a gun, freedom to shoot up the place, freedom to have mayhem, freedom to smoke and have drugs or to pass drugs, freedom to have children with no responsibility. Freedom and responsibility come together. And unfortunately, we've been producing a consciousness that highlights the freedom. And we have not quite highlighted the responsibility that must be balanced with authentic freedom. All true freedom has freedom and responsibility in a delicate balance. And I think that too has to be an emancipation theme that we have to be willing to focus ourselves with. And I'm saying it will require pundit, politician, priest, community worker, and et al. Joining hands in a commitment to true freedom. We have a choice. Let us make commitment now or face the next unfortunate event that will capitulate us out of the emancipation process or will help us to take the emancipation process move forward. In the 1970s, Jerry Pantin left St. Mary's College and went into the hills of Laventille for this reason, because he heard the cry of the process of emancipation that was unfinished. And he went to do what he could do. And Serval has been one of the incredible gifts to this nation from the Catholic Church, because it was Father Jerry Pantin and Westwall, and Father Jerry was the one who carried Serval, and then Sister Ruth after Father Jerry. And it has been an incredible gift to this nation of development for the same little black boy. The ADP program, the Adolescent Development Program, which reoriented the brain of the adolescent to understand what true consciousness means. Taking a teenage boy and put him in a nursery to change diapers and to learn how to care for children. All of these were part of their models. We're doing now in the East Port of Spain. I've moved some young priests into the East Port of Spain. And we're looking at models now in East Port of Spain for the church to grow a model of engagement in Beetham, Sealots, Laventille, Mova, Duncan Street, Nelson Street communities, to see how we can engage and accompany these communities along the lines of development to bring the emancipation journey to the next stage.
In terms of partnering, using your priests and ecclesial community, I hope that part of this would be to develop their consciousness about their origin, consciousness about why it is, we have struggled for over 100 and something years after emancipation to be where we are, and how we need to move from this point. And they need to move from this point, and we are providing assistance. Now, I know that you're talking about looking at East Port of Spain, Sealots, Beetham, Laventille, and Gonzales, and so on. But I guess this is your starting point, and where you would do where the genesis, if you want to call it genesis, would be?
It is not Genesis. Remember, in the 1970s, Father Pantin did this.
Yes.
In a national stage. I have done this in Gonzales, and Clyde Harvey has done this in Gonzales and Laventille. So this is not a starting, this is a continuation. Okay. But this is asking now in the 21st century, what are the particular needs of the most urgent communities that need to be faced, and how do we as church help in bringing these communities to face the challenge that we're looking at? There's not a beginning. There's the journey that is continuing.
Okay.
That's what's important.
So the journey continues.
Oh, yes. So my key message, emancipation is not an event. It's a process that continues to unfold even today. We all can contribute to this journey. Action steps. Reflect on the attitude you have towards the little black boy. Scare quotes. Is it in keeping with God's love for him? List the 10 little black boys that did extraordinarily well in Trinidad and Tobago. And if you can't list 10, you're in trouble, because we have hundreds that we can list who have done extraordinarily well in Trinidad and Tobago. And my scripture reading, Exodus 40. That's a pivotal passage in Exodus where God really starts shaping the consciousness of the people to the formation of a new people with a new understanding of themselves by coming to a new understanding of their God.
Thank you so much for taking us on this conversation that the emancipation journey continues, and that we are all God's chosen people coming straight out of Exodus. God's chosen people destined to the promised land, for the promised land, a land full of milk and honey. Could you say a little prayer with us as we say good evening?
Father, we thank you for your incredible love for us. And we pray, oh God, that out of your abundance and mercy and love, that we will find a way to bring all of your children to know you, love you, and save you, to find true freedom, and to raise consciousness through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Archbishop Jason. Don't forget, pick up your Catholic News. You could get it online, or you could buy one, or have it delivered. God bless you. See you next week.